$40 billion. Let that sink in for a moment.
Hmm.
That's the kind of number we're talking about for a huge scientific project we're diving into today. CERN's idea for the Future Circular Collider, the FCC.
Right, the FCC. It's positioned as the next big step after the Large Hadron Collider.
And we're going to try and get under the hood, figure out what it's all about. We're
Yeah.
basing this discussion largely on a really interesting, quite critical article you shared.
Yeah, by Sabine Hossenfelder. It's titled The $40 Billion Particle Collider That May Never Be Built. And she definitely raises some serious questions. That'll be our main guide here.
Okay, so our mission for everyone listening is to really unpack the FCC. What is it exactly? Why does it cost, well, a fortune? And crucially, why are smart people like Hossenfelder pumping the brakes, questioning if it's really the best way forward for physics?
Exactly. We want to give you the big picture on this debate.
So you walk away with a clear sense of what's at stake. Okay, let's jump in. What is this Future Circular Collider?
Well, think of the Large Hadron Collider, the LHC, right? Groundbreaking machine.
Mm-hmm.
The FCC is essentially planned as its successor. A next-generation particle smasher, but, much bigger.
Bigger how?
Well, the plan has two main stages, sort of. First, there's something called FCCE. That would collide electrons and positrons.
Okay, fundamental particles.
Right. Smashing them gives you incredibly precise measurements. Think like super high-res photos of particles we already know about the Higgs boson, other standard model stuff.
So phase 1 is about getting sharper details on the known particles. Makes sense. What about phase 2? You said it was more ambitious.
That's the FCCHH. Here, they'd upgrade the machine to smash protons together, aiming for energies up to 85 TeV.
85 TeV. How does that compare to the LHC?
It's about 6 times the energy the LHC reaches now. Huge jump.
Wow.
And because protons are, composite particles, not fundamental like electrons, smashing with these crazy energies, well, the hope is you might create totally new, heavier particles, stuff beyond the standard model.
6 times the energy? That is a leap. And this isn't just using the old LHC tunnel, right? This needs new infrastructure.
Oh, yeah, completely new. They're talking about a 91-kilometer ring tunnel.
91 kilometers. The LHC is, what, 27?
Exactly. Over 3 times the circumference. It's an absolutely massive engineering project. Epic scale, really.
Epic scale. And I'm guessing an epic price tag to match. You mentioned the $40 billion figure. Is that the official estimate?
It's, let's say, the current working estimate, north of $40 billion. It's a staggering amount of money.
Hard to even wrap your head around it. And the timeline. When would this thing actually start doing science?
The projection is for operations to start sometime in the mid-2070s.
2070, so like 50 years from now.
Pretty much. And, as Hossenfelder points out quite strongly in her article, these kinds of mega projects, they almost always run into delays, significant ones.
Right. So mid-2070s is maybe the best case scenario.
Probably, yeah. It's a useful target, but you have to be realistic.
Okay, so decades of work, tens of billions of dollars. This brings us right to Hossenfelder's critique. Why is she and others so skeptical? What's the core issue for her?
Her opposition kind of boils down to a few key things. A big one is what you might call scientific redundancy, or maybe lack of immediate necessity.
Meaning what, exactly?
She basically argues there aren't any really urgent, burning questions in physics right now that absolutely require the FCC's specific energy range to solve.
So she's saying the LHC hasn't hit a wall yet, that we don't need this bigger machine just yet to make progress.
That's a big part of it. Look, finding the Higgs boson in 2012 was huge, right? It kind of completed the standard model, our current map of fundamental particles and forces.
Big success for the LHC.
Yeah, absolutely. But Hossenfelder's point is the FCC, especially that first E stage, is mostly about measuring those known particles more precisely. It's refinement, not necessarily revolution. And she questions if spending $40 billion plus for slightly better measurements of things we already discovered is the best use of resources, especially when there's no guarantee the higher energy stage will find anything fundamentally new.
That's a stark way to put it. Is refinement worth that much? What else worries her?
Another major concern is the resource drain. Not just money, but brain power, too.
How so?
Well, think about it. You'd have thousands of top physicists tied up for decades on this single massive project. Hossenfelder worries this creates a huge opportunity cost.
Meaning resources that could be going elsewhere.
Exactly. She points to other really exciting, maybe faster-moving fields, things like quantum computing, which is exploding, gravitational wave astronomy that's opened a whole new window on the universe.
Right, LIGO and all that.
Yeah. Or even developing totally new, maybe cheaper accelerator technologies. Her fear is the FCC becomes this kind of black hole sucking in talent and funding that could be driving breakthroughs in these other areas.
So it's about spreading the bets, scientifically speaking. Don't put all the eggs in one giant, very expensive basket.
That's a good way to think about it. And then there are the practical hurdles she raises, the economic and political headwinds.
Beyond just the $40 billion figure itself.
Yeah. She points out CERN's current budget isn't enough. They'd need member states to chip in way more, plus find an extra, like, $5 billion from somewhere.
Which sounds challenging, especially now.
Very challenging.
Yeah.
She mentions Germany, for instance, is already struggling with funding its own big science projects. So are they really going to pour billions more into a CERN project? Probably not easily. And then there's environmental oppositions starting to build. She notes this petition from hundreds of French scientists worried about the ecological footprint of digging a 91-kilometer tunnel.
So funding, politics, environment. It's not just about the physics case.
No, it's a whole complex package.
Yeah.
And this resource drain point, it really gets to the heart of the skepticism, Is this the smartest investment overall?
And it sounds like Hossenfelder isn't a lone voice crying in the wilderness here. Are others in the physics community echoing these concerns?
Oh, definitely. Her article mentions several others. Helena Abramovich, for example, warned the FCC could starve other important science. Olivier Paté criticized the huge environmental and financial costs.
Okay, so there's real debate happening.
There is. And Hossenfelder also brings up a point made by Ruben Saccone, suggesting the FCC might be seen as a kind of pet project of CERN leadership.
Implying there might be pressure to support it.
Yeah, the implication is that maybe there's pressure for scientists, especially those linked to CERN, to present a unified front, even if they have private reservations. That can make open debate difficult.
Right, that adds another layer of complexity. So if the FCC is facing all this pushback, are there alternatives being seriously considered, other ways to push physics forward?
Yes, absolutely. And Hossenfelder highlights a couple of really interesting ones. One is the Muon Collider.
Muon Collider, what's that?
Okay, so instead of electrons or protons, you collide muons. Muons are like heavier cousins of electrons. The big appeal is that a Muon Collider could potentially be much smaller, cheaper, and maybe ready sooner than the FCC.
Smaller, cheaper, sooner. Sounds good.
It does. Plus, it's novel technology one hasn't been built before. So there's a lot of scientific excitement around it, potentially probing physics in a totally different way than proton or electron colliders. Hossenfelder notes it seems quite popular among younger physicists, actually.
Interesting. New tech, maybe more agile. What's the other main alternative?
The other big one is China's collider plan. This is a major factor.
China. What are they planning?
Essentially, they're proposing something very similar in concept to the FCC, a huge circular collider. But here's the kicker. They aim to build it for roughly half the cost of the FCC and in half the time, maybe around 20 years.
Half the cost, half the time. How?
Well, details are still emerging, but that's the proposal. It also has two phases like the FCC, an electron-positron stage for Higgs physics, then a super-proton collider aiming for 125 TeV.
Wait, 125 TeV. That's even higher energy than the FCCH plan.
Exactly. Higher energy, potentially half the cost, decades sooner. And crucially, Hossenfelder reports it's a top-rated project in China's next big science plan, due in 2026. Approval looks pretty likely.
Okay, this seems like a potential game changer if China builds this thing.
Right. What happens to the FCC? That's the massive question Hossenfelder raises.
What are the implications if China pulls this off?
Well, the stark possibility is that China's collider could make the FCC obsolete before it's even switched on in the 2070s.
Wow.
Why would the world invest $40 billion plus in CERN's machine if a cheaper, more powerful one is already running in China maybe 20 or 30 years earlier? It completely changes the strategic landscape for particle physics.
It really does. Suddenly, the FCC looks like a much riskier bet, doesn't it?
It certainly adds a huge element of risk and uncertainty.
Now, Hossenfelder has this really punchy way of summarizing her core argument about the FCC's value, right?
She does. It's quite memorable. Her ironic punchline, as she calls it.
Which?
That the FCC is potentially the most expensive way to get a slightly better measurement of a particle discovered in 2012.
Oof, that cuts right to the chase.
It really does. It encapsulates her whole argument. Are we potentially spending an astronomical sum for incremental gains on known physics, namely the Higgs boson, when that money and effort could be driving truly new discoveries elsewhere?
It's a powerful frame for the debate, asking if the scientific return really justifies that scale of investment.
Precisely. And she kind of wraps up her piece by reflecting more broadly on what science is really about.
Which is?
Not just building the biggest possible machine. It's about understanding the universe.
Yeah.
And she argues that requires a diverse approach, investing across many different scientific frontiers, not just betting everything on one colossal infrastructure project. Healthy progress needs diverse exploration.
So let's try to pull this together. We've looked at the FCC, its huge ambition, the scale, the $40 billion plus price tag, the decades-long timeline. And we've dug into the serious questions raised by critics like Sabine Hossenfelder about scientific necessity, resource strain, opportunity costs, political hurdles.
And the very real competition now, especially from China, but also potentially from alternatives like the Muon Collider.
Right. It paints a really complex picture of a major decision point for particle physics. As you think about this whole debate, what stands out most to you? What's the key tension?
For me, it's that tension between the undeniable draw of these incredibly ambitious generational projects like the FCC, the desire to build the biggest, most powerful tool possible, and the need for, well, maybe more agility, investing in a wider range of potentially disruptive ideas like the Muon Collider, or even things we haven't thought of yet.
Right, the allure of the mega project versus a more diversified portfolio.
Exactly. And China's potential entry just throws that tension into really sharp relief. It forces a fundamental rethink of the global strategy.
That makes sense. And that leads us nicely to a final thought for our listeners to chew on. Given everything we've discussed, it's the immense costs, the decades involved, the potential for alternatives, or even obsolescence, how should the global science community balance these grand long-haul projects against potentially nimbler, perhaps more innovative, maybe even riskier approaches in the quest for fundamental knowledge?
Yeah. Where's the sweet spot?
It's a tough question, and the answer will really shape how we explore the universe in the coming decades. Lots to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.